Your Honor, as the court is aware, there's three overarching things that the court must consider when sentencing an individual. The first would be the gravity, the seriousness of the offense. The court also has to consider the defendant's character, and the court has to consider the need to protect the public. The defendant was found guilty of 3 crimes. Count 1 carries with it a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. The only consideration as it comes to count 1 is whether or not the court makes Mr. Anderson eligible for extended supervision at some point after serving 20 years of initial confinement. The state's request and recommendation of the court today is to impose life imprisonment and not make the defendant eligible for extended supervision as it goes to count 1. As to count 2 and count 3, the state would be recommending the court impose the maximum sentences and run those consecutive to one another and consecutive to the life sentence on count 1. To begin with the seriousness of the offense, obviously the court was here for the jury trial. I want to just highlight what I think the most important things were as it relates to what considerations there are today at sentencing. On April 1st, 2024, Shotti Robinson went to work at Pizza Shuttle like it was any other day. She had that job for a while. The day began like any other day. She left her apartment on Commerce Street, went to work, and then later on in the day was texting with the defendant, and they agreed to meet up after she got off work around 5 p.m. They went to Twisted Fisherman. They were there from shortly after 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. And then they went to Duke's on Water, Shotti driving them both in her Honda Civic, and they stayed there until about 9 p.m. They left Duke's on Water. They went to Maxwell Anderson's house at 3161 South 39th Street. Again, Shotti Robinson driving her 2020 Honda Civic, and they remained in his house for several hours. And what we know is that while at his house, Shotti became incapacitated. She was grabbed, groped, had her clothing removed, until she was removed from his house around 12:45 a.m. going into April 2nd. She was taken from the defendant's house by the defendant in her own car and driven around the county. And the defendant chose to ultimately go to what was his secret beach at Warnemont Park and dispose of Shotti Robinson in the early morning hours of April 2nd. He took her body down to the shores of Lake Michigan. He cut her up into pieces and disposed of her in the lake, mostly in the lake. And then he took her car, left Warnemont Park, drove to the north side of Milwaukee, set her car on fire on 30th and Lisbon. In the course of doing that, in the course of disposing of her vehicle, he also discarded her left leg in the 31st and Galena playground, just a couple blocks away from where he set her car on fire. He calmly walked away and walked to a bus stop and returned home by a bus, Milwaukee County Transit bus, and then went about his life as if nothing happened. He went to work that day at Dugout 54. Later that night, April 2nd, Shotti's right leg was found on the shores of Lake Michigan at Warnemont Park, and shortly after that, on the night of April 2nd, she was reported missing to police. For the next several days, as her family and friends wondered where she was, there were searches underway, and additional remains of hers were then recovered at the 31st and Galena playground. The police investigation allowed them to learn that the defendant was the last person she was with, the last person she communicated with, and he was ultimately arrested on April 4th. Days later, her torso was found badly decomposed, washed ashore in South Milwaukee. He had cut off both of her legs, cut off one of her arms, cut off one of her breasts, and cut off her head. Her head has never been recovered. As you can tell from what you've read in the letters and heard today, Shotti was a completely innocent victim. She died alone in an unfamiliar place. Her last moments had to have been terrifying. And then after being killed, she was disgraced in the worst way imaginable, having her body cut into pieces, having her head cut off by the defendant who tried to make her disappear from the world. So when the court is looking at the seriousness of what Maxwell Anderson did, you have to consider who Shotti was. She was a 19-year-old young woman, totally innocent. And as you've learned through the statements today, the PSI, hearing her friends and family testify, she was just getting into adulthood. She had just gotten that apartment on North Commerce. She had just bought that 2020 Honda Civic. It was a point of pride for her. It was it was a marker of adulthood, a marker of independence. She was ambitious. She had dreams. She wanted to succeed. She wanted to be productive. She went to school. She worked 2 jobs. And as you know, she was adored and loved by everybody, by all of those around her, her coworkers, her family, her friends, everybody. This is the most heinous crime this court will see. It doesn't get more serious than this, and it shows that the defendant has a depraved heart, and he has demonstrated a total lack of remorse, lack of accountability, and the gravity of this offense supports never letting him out of prison. When considering the defendant's character, we look at, for one, his criminal record. He has 6 prior criminal convictions. They are outlined in the pre-sentence report, and I think it's worth going through some of those, all of those, and the other conduct that's described in that report to get an idea of his character, and then to look at how that behavior was reflected in what he did to Shotti. In 2014, he was convicted of a disorderly conduct, domestic violence incident. There was a read-in charge of disorderly conduct. This incident involved a domestic disturbance where he became violent during an argument with his mother. He damaged some property, pushed his mother, got into a physical altercation with his mother's fiance at the time, and it resulted in that person sustaining an injury, and Mr. Anderson himself sustained an injury during that. He was convicted, as I said, of disorderly conduct, and he was given a fine. In 2015, he was charged and convicted with another disorderly conduct, a domestic abuse crime, criminal damage to property, and misdemeanor witness intimidation. There was another charge of criminal damage to property dismissed and read in. This incident also involved a domestic disturbance, this time with his grandparents, where he again became violent, threw things around, punched a hole in the wall, broke a phone. When his grandparents tried to call the police, and then he left. This time he was placed on probation and fined. He was discharged from probation. Fast forward to 2020, he was convicted of disorderly conduct. He had a dismissed and read-in count of misdemeanor battery. This incident involved the defendant beating up a man on Wisconsin Avenue when the man purportedly tried to intervene in an argument between the defendant and a female that the defendant was with. There was a video taken by a bystander that showed the defendant on top of the victim hitting him with a closed fist in the head while the victim was on the ground trying to protect himself. Ultimately, again, he was convicted of disorderly conduct. He was placed on probation. He had previously picked up an OWI first offense, and then in 2022, he was convicted of OWI second offense after being pulled over going 70 and a 30 after 2 a.m. He was given a breath test and came back at a .145, and during this incident was also cited for disorderly conduct for urinating on the interview room that he was taken to by police after his arrest. There is a 2015 incident mentioned in the PSI. It's not a criminal conviction, it's just an operating without a license forfeiture. And then the PSI also brings about this 2010 incident where he was caught at what appears to be an underage drinking party, and after being detained became belligerent, vulgar with police, urinated in the police vehicle that he was put inside. Since being arrested for this case, he has been in the Milwaukee County Jail. There have been numerous instances of misconduct while in the jail. Some of those are talked about in the PSI as well. I was provided with approximately 21 incidents of disciplinary infractions during his time at the jail, usually involving verbal abuse to jail staff, name-calling, non-compliance with the rules. There was one incident of him defecating on himself during transport after one of the days of the jury trial, and another incident where he had apparently damaged some property, an electrical box, in the jail. Generally, his behavior while he's been in custody for this case at the jail, he's been a nuisance. What I think is important to take away from all of that is that this was not an isolated incident of violence. He has demonstrated in the past that he is capable of acting violent. But I think what speaks most to his character is the depravity of what he did in this case. I think all of that shows he has a violent, dangerous character and also supports this court not giving him an opportunity at extended supervision. As far as the need to protect the public, it simply couldn't be higher here. As I stated, this is the worst kind of crime there is, done in the worst way, leaving a family and a community shattered and distraught, and the public needs to be protected from this type of behavior, and life imprisonment guarantees that. This incident had, as this court is aware, a tremendously negative impact on the community at large, on the public. The public was completely shaken by this. Members of our community, young women in particular, deserve to feel safe, deserve to feel like they can meet new people, go on a date, and not fear for their safety. And he took that sense of security away from countless people, and he does not care. The last thing I would highlight is the impact on the victim and the victim's family. Anytime there is a loss of life, it's going to have a tremendous negative impact on a family. But what happened to Shotti Robinson was not just tragic, it was an unconscionably vicious act of violence that violated her dignity. He had her unconscious, was grabbing her, groping her, removing her clothing. He killed her. He then cut her body into pieces and sought to have her disappear. It was simply evil and heartless behavior. And anytime a child is lost, a family obviously is going to grieve and going to suffer. But in this instance, that loss of life was compounded by the brutality and the viciousness of what he did to her body after she was dead. And to add to that horrible reality of what they had to hear happen to her, they also have to live with the reality that her entire body has not been found. Her head, to this day, remains in an unknown location. And the fact that her head remains in an unknown location inhibits their ability to find peace, and it inhibits their ability to believe that Shotti has found peace wherever her soul may be. And he's the cause of that. When you consider what her family went through, on top of losing a loved one, they had to deal with the agony, which was bolstered by the fact that they didn't know where she was missing, or what happened to her. And meanwhile, he's continuing on with his life as if nothing had happened. And all any parent or friend or family member would want to know in those moments is that their loved one is safe, or that they just want to know where they are. And it was and continues to be torturous to their family, to Shotti's family, because they don't have that answer as to where all of her is, where her head is. And still to this day, there remain unknowns that will likely forever haunt them. And the family can't even say goodbye to her because part of her is still out there somewhere. And he's shown no remorse for what happened. He has not accepted responsibility for what occurred. And his failure to accept responsibility has further caused the victim's loved one pain and reinforces his heartless character, which we've already discussed and which the court must consider here today. Again, simply put, there is no more depraved of an offense that this court could see. The defendant murdered Shotti, tried to rid the world of her being. It's the worst behavior any human can engage in. It shows he has no morals, no sense of dignity, no remorse, and there's only one sentence that is suitable for that kind of violent and evil behavior, and it's imprisonment for the rest of his life.
Thank you. Defense.
Thank you. We'd have Maxwell's father, Steve Anderson, start by making us saying a few words.